This is Music Maker with Tyler Kline, a podcast from Loose Leaf Transmissions. Hello, folks. Welcome back to this new season of Music Maker. And I guess season, I'm using that term loosely. Nevertheless, I'm Tyler Kline. Very glad to have you along. And if this is your first time listening, normally I would open up by sharing a little bit about myself and what this podcast is all about. But this episode, as with the very first episode of the podcast ever, is a solo show. And I'm about to tell you at length about myself. So that very first episode that I mentioned was basically all about my journey to start this podcast, which had little to do with my work as a composer and mostly focused on all the work I've done in broadcasting that kind of laid the groundwork and led me to do this whole thing. So if you want to hear that, check it out. And really, I'd encourage you to listen to all of the episodes of this podcast so far to hear from all the amazing guests that I've had on this show. This episode is going to be a little unusual in that I will be answering my own questions that I usually ask my guests. If you haven't listened to the podcast before, I have a series of questions that everybody gets asked, and then I kind of craft questions for each guest kind of pertaining to the work that they do. So in that sense, I'll try to make things flow in a sensible manner, but I will be referencing each question throughout this episode. Also, like moments before I started recording this, I put out a call on social media for folks to ask me any questions they might have about my creative work, which I know is poor planning on my part, but I've got some wind in my sails to get this recorded, and I did not want to wait around for those questions. So anyway, there may come a point after I record the majority of this episode that I go back and record answers to any questions that come in later and kind of edit them in. And if that's the case, I'll make every effort to make things feel as integrated as possible. Ideally, you'll never know that I have gone back and recorded things at different times, but just giving you a heads up in case there's a little change to my voice at times throughout this episode. It's, mostly same voice day to day, but things do tend to happen. Before I get into this episode, I just want to take a moment to thank my Patreon subscribers for supporting the show and all the other Loose Leaf Transmissions efforts with a financial contribution. And, for just $5 a month, you too can make a huge difference in allowing me to bring you these great conversations with composers and other types of artists. And if you'd like to join them, those already supporting, just head on over to looseleaftransmissions.com/support. It's kind of a central hub for you to get on over to the Patreon, or if you don't want to give monthly, I have a coffee link, but I don't think anyone's ever actually done that. So I don't know, maybe you could be the first if you just want to make a one-time gift. Either way, again, looseleaftransmissions.com/support. And the final thing that I want to say for now, at least regarding housekeeping, so to speak, is just a few days, just the day before yesterday, prior to the release of this episode of Music Maker, I've launched a new podcast called Micro Maker, which takes excerpts from the longer episodes of Music Maker and repackages them into a short format, good for commutes or if you just need something to listen to for like 10 to 20 minutes. Subscribe to Micro Maker wherever you listen to podcasts. And new episodes release Tuesdays and Fridays. All right, on to this episode, all about my creative life. So typically on Music Maker, I kind of launch each episode by asking every guest the same series of questions that kind of give us an overview of their artistic journey from as early an age as possible and kind of connect the dots and see what kind of threads there may be that started way back when. And so these questions consist of what is your earliest artistic memory? When was your first encounter with a composer or like a craftsperson, whatever my guest happens to be doing? When did you know that you wanted to pursue your craft as a career? And can you just share an overview of your creative journey? Was it more conventional or was it kind of unexpected? So rather than kind of go line by line with these questions, I'm just going to kind of riff through my life, I guess, and see where that gets us. So yeah, and I'll start, from as early as I can remember with my own artistic memories. And I think my early memories as really not quite a composer, but a musician center around an electric organ that was in my grandparents' house. So I think I've said this on the podcast before. I am the first professional musician in my family. And growing up, my parents, neither of them are musicians. And so I didn't grow up in a musical household, but my dad's parents both played music in high school. And so my grandpa, he played trumpet. Actually, I think he played cornet in high school, and he never really played it after that, to my knowledge. But he played the cornet, and that's kind of why when it came time to sign up for a middle school band, I wanted to play the trumpet. I wanted to be just like this kind of hero figure in my family. And my grandmother played the piano, but she didn't have a piano in her house. She had an electric organ. As a side note, when it came time for me to take piano lessons in middle school, because I was starting to show an interest in that, the person I ended up taking lessons with was this very old lady who also gave my grandmother piano lessons when my grandmother was like a child. So that's always been like kind of interesting to me. But at any rate, there's photos of me, which I think I've put on social media before, of like me as maybe a 1-year-old sitting at this organ. So I was always like attracted to making noise on this thing. And kind of growing up, the TV would be going, and I think I would just start like picking out melodies. I would start like playing along with the television or playing along to like cartoon music that, whatever cartoon theme songs that were in my head, I would just like figure them out on the keyboard. And so I think that's really like when I think about the core of where did it all begin, certainly it was there. Whether or not I would qualify that as composing, you decide. Transcribing maybe. And I think transcription and using my ears to recreate the music around me was truly like the gateway for me to begin tinkering with music. I wouldn't go as far to say as like composing quite yet, but certainly from like, an early age of 5, 6, 7, 8, up until I joined middle school band, I had no idea what I was doing. Neither did anyone in my family, but I had access to instruments and I would just kind of play what I heard. And I would play it accurately, which I don't know where that came from, but it's a very intuitive thing for me, which I think ends up being a kind of thread through this whole thing. It wasn't until I joined middle school band that obviously I became aware of like this kind of wider world of, it's still quite small in the grand scheme of things looking back at it at this point. But at the time it was a much wider world than what, I could have ever dreamed of. And I was getting to like participate alongside other people and play music. And I think the first inklings of an interest in music composition came early on when I was in middle school band. I remember, anyone who's played in middle school band has probably played the music of Robert W. Smith, for example. That name sticks out in my head, especially because, even with a beginning band piece that it's like bare bones musical elements, in the key of B flat with easy to play rhythms and stuff like that. I was captivated by the fact that like this is music that I get to play. And as kind of a parallel to all of this, we always had a computer in my house when I was growing up because my grandfather worked for IBM. And so we just had computers and, I guess he got some from work and there was a computer in his house. There was a computer in our house, probably other family members' houses. And so at a certain point, we had a computer that was like Windows 95 and I was able to get on the internet, this would have been dial-up internet, and download a very simple notation software. I think it was called Noteworthy Composer or something like that. It was free. This would have been, circa 2000. And I remember like, having that on the computer. Somehow I figured out where to get it, or I don't know, maybe it was already there. I really don't know or recall or remember. But I remember, finding these pieces we were playing in band, finding MIDI recordings of them, and importing that into this notation software and having like the full score in front of me. And, the first things I remember doing would be like changing the instruments, like messing around with the orchestration of things and extending parts that I liked, and just kind of like, I'm sure that like, had I thrown this up on the internet nowadays or something, like it would be totally illegal. But, for me as like a 12-year-old kid, it was just like, I would just get lost in doing all of it. I would just spend hours. I didn't have to be on the internet for it either, which meant I didn't have to tie up the phone line. So I think that was like, okay, that's like the first moments of like, maybe there's like some kind of composing inclination here. That would have been in middle school, and I kept doing that. And I think I maybe tried to write some original stuff, but mostly I was taking the music we were playing in band class and importing into this program. There was a great site that I loved, like videogamemusic.com or something like that. And it had like, I was really into video games, and, I would download the MIDIs to my favorite music from video games and import that and kind of do the same sort of stuff, reorchestrate it, make them bigger or smaller, or, something like that. And so I was doing that for like a while. And it wasn't until I got into high school that, I don't know if I realized, or like there became like this practicality of using this software to make my life, like my real life music life, better, for lack of a better word. I was learning to play electric bass in jazz band. By the way, just an aside, because I guess it's important. I started middle school band playing the trumpet. In 8th grade, I switched to the baritone or euphonium. And I was always trying to learn new instruments. So at certain points I learned the trombone. I started learning piano, taking piano lessons. And I was learning to play the electric bass in jazz band because that's what we needed, I guess. So I remember encountering, slash notation for the first time in one of the songs we were playing in jazz band, and not really knowing what to do. And it was kind of explained to me okay, you have the chord symbols, and as the bass player, you're pretty much just playing the notes on the page. And then, if you want to get real deep, these chord symbols will tell you other notes you can play to embellish the bass line. But as the bass player, just worry about the notes that you see on the page. And I remember playing that and being like, man, this is surely this can be a little more interesting. And so my high school band director at the time, shout out to Travis Bond, because, he's became a very pivotal person early on in my musicianship in general, but also as a composer. He was like, well, here's a recording of this big band playing this song. Maybe you can listen to it and get an idea about what to do. And it was totally different from anything that could have been written on the page. Certainly way more than, these chord changes that were being presented. And so I ended up transcribing what I heard, note for note, rhythm for rhythm. And then we met for jazz band and I played it. And everyone was like, what are you doing? You sound just like the recording. And it's I don't want to think about coming up with something on the spot. I was just learning the instrument. I was barely able to read notes on the page, really, even though I ended up transcribing this real life bass line to end up playing. So that's what I did. And so that kind of beginning in transcription, I would keep doing that and transcribing music that I could play instead of, inventing something on the spot. And then working in transcription led me to arranging. And so again, Travis Bond, my high school band director, was very encouraging and supportive of all of this weird stuff that I was trying to do. And so, if it was, basketball band season and there was a song that I felt interested in arranging, I was like, hey, can I arrange this for the band to play at basketball bands? Again, probably illegal, but he was like, yeah, let's see what you got. And so that slowly evolved into him requesting songs for me to arrange, over the course of the 4 years of high school. And at this point, I'm working in Finale Notepad, I think is the like the rudimentary version of Finale notation software. I'm arranging, I'm transcribing, and then naturally I just start composing. I'm already in this software and I'm composing. And I remember like composing just like very impractical stuff for like piano with, it was very like actually Frank Zappa-esque kind of music that never got played. It's just like I would like compose stuff just because it's like what I wanted to hear, which I guess is the point of being a composer in a lot of ways. Like you create stuff that maybe doesn't exist in some form or fashion and you want to hear it. And so you use your imagination and you make it happen. So that's what I was doing. And so finally, I think I was a junior in high school when I wrote like a little brass choir piece, and my high school band director got students together and we played it. And we played it at graduation of all places. And so that was really like, obviously that was like a pivotal moment. I was about 16, I think, and having my music played by real musicians. And it was like, oh, okay. Yeah, this is something I want to do. I mean, all through this time, my high school band director he really thought about new music and composers. I think he did some sort of program for wind band conductors that was very composer focused. They would bring in guest composers and all that stuff. We were always playing like the newest music. Like we were playing John Mackey music at that time, which was pretty new, I think. And we would go to honor band programs, and I'd get to kind of interact with composers, from a distance, like they would conduct. I'm thinking of Sam Hazo comes to mind, is one composer that I played his music at some point and he was conducting. And so, I was kind of starting to encounter composers, but again, it was at a distance, and I was certainly being introduced to the new music being created, based on what we played in high school band. So yeah, I definitely had this awareness of contemporary music, and but I don't know if it was like very front of mind, I guess you could say. So all of that was happening in high school. It came time to go to college, and I ended up going to Morehead State University. So again, I was playing euphonium. I was quite good at euphonium. I was taking euphonium lessons with the professor at Morehead, Dr. Stacy Baker, through high school, and it was like 30 minutes from home, which felt, far enough away, but close enough that, it felt like, that's where I should go. But they did not have any music composition program at all. No music composition teacher, no class. I think there was like an arranging class, but it was like through the lens of like educational purposes, I guess. I think I really don't remember. I never took that class. I guess I was already arranging and didn't feel a need to. But at any rate, I ended up at Morehead as a music education major because that's what you were supposed to do. And I did not like it. I really didn't like it. And it took a full year for me to kind of get enrolled in my first education class. Fortunately, it was a music education class and not like a general education class. And immediately I knew like, this isn't what I want to do. Like I'm composing. At this point, I had written a piece for a friend of mine, or it was happening at the same time as this first semester of my sophomore year. I was in this music education class, and I had composed a piece for trombone and piano that a friend of mine performed on like student recital hour. And we recorded it. And I remember the day that we had scheduled to record it, it was at the same time as this music education class. And I asked the professor, can I like not be in this class this day so I can go be at the recording of my piece? And I was told, no, you have to come to class. And so I didn't go to class. I I prioritized the recording session. And that recording I sent in to Kentucky Music Educators Association, like collegiate composition competition or whatever. I didn't know what I was doing, but I sent it in and it was picked and it got played. And it was like my first big award. And it was like such a validating moment for me that it's like, okay, I skipped my class, but something really good came out of it. And you know what? I don't want to do music education. But I didn't really have much other options, in terms of like what degree to get. There was no composition degree, even though I was composing a lot. I was composing a lot for fun, in the dorm room at night. And some of it, ended up getting played and I like put it in front of people and, they were excited about it. But, I really had to sit down and figure out like, how do I continue to do this? How do I like be a composer when this is the situation that I'm in? And so I kind of navigated it in two ways. One, I decided to get the what was like a really negatively viewed degree at that time, probably still is, the Bachelor of Arts in Music, which was just a general music degree. And I decided that that's what I was going to do because I didn't want to perform. I didn't want a performance degree. So I got the BA in music going on. I had to have a minor. I got a minor in business. And so I thought, well, business skills might help if I'm trying to be a composer. And the other thing that Moorhead offered, which really helped me kind of solidify my path as a composer, it was an undergraduate research fellowship. And it could, like, you could choose any research topic. You could submit, like, this is, apply for this program. And if you were awarded it, I think it was either like by semester or by year, you got to work with a faculty mentor and kind of pursue this research and get paid for it too, I think. And so I applied for that with composition projects, like creative projects. Kind of doing creative research. I did the research fellowship 2 years. 1 year was, I believe, related to the Julia Cameron book, The Artist's Way. My mentor, Dr. Deb Eastwood, she was really vital. She wasn't a composer, but getting to work with her through these undergraduate research fellowships really made a huge difference, I think. And she introduced me to The Artist's Way and thought, you're trying to learn about the creative process, really, and trying to figure out how to be a composer. Maybe this book would be a great tool and we can just research the book. And so that's what we did 1 year. And then the next year, my research was all about melody, which is kind of funny to think back on. And so I like studied scores and whatnot and tried to like connect the dots with melody and I produced some music and that kind of thing. So anyway, all to say, while I did not like work with a composer or have experience in a composition program, these undergraduate research fellowships made a tremendous difference, and I think laying the foundation for what I do today, even. And like this kind of self-starter, autodidactic, I think is the word, approach to things. I mean, it's really like that's what I've learned is like the best path for me, which I'll talk about in a minute. But, in doing these research fellowships, I remember going to the library a lot, and I would just like spend as much time as I could in the library looking through the music books. There was like oversized score sections in the library that like no one else I knew was looking at, but I was, at least to my knowledge, and discovering like George Crumb's oversized scores in these places and like finding the score to the Rite of Spring and like all this different stuff was just like there. And I would spend like just as much time like listening and looking at scores. But what I would soon learn soon after this, after I graduated, once I started grad school, is, I was really only looking at like a small slice of what could be considered contemporary music. So again, I'm going to get to that in a moment. I think what I knew at this point was that the only way I knew how to move forward was that I had to get into a grad school composition program. And again, there were no composers around me, like professional composers or composer faculty. I remember I took like a lesson with a guy. There's a composition program in Kentucky. This is all in Kentucky, by the way. I haven't mentioned that yet. But at any rate, there's a composition program at Center College in Kentucky, of all places. And I remember taking a lesson with this guy. And I don't remember anything about the lesson, but he gave me like an old copy of Samuel Adler's orchestration book. And, and that was it. And didn't really go anywhere past that. But of course, that book has been invaluable to me. And it wasn't until my senior year when I was applying to programs, kind of just like taking shots in the dark, not knowing what I was doing, that a composer came to Moorhead. And this would be, I think, my first encounter with a composer. And that's James Grant. We were premiering a work of his, a double concerto for tuba and euphonium with a wind band. And he came to work with the wind band, and my tuba euphonium professor, Dr. Stacy Baker, was obviously premiering this piece with her duo. And so she was like, "Do you want to meet with Jim? Do you want to take a composition lesson with Jim?" And I said, "Yeah, I'd like that, please." So I had a lesson with Jim, and I was showing him some music of mine that I'd written for flute and saxophone. This piece was like kind of a big time piece for me. The flute and saxophone professors at Moorhead had asked me to write this piece for them. The way they approached me about it was the flute professor taught music history, and I was taking a music history class. It was a required class or whatever, and I got like a paper back, like a essay that I'd written that was graded. And at the bottom of the essay, she had written, would love to have you write a piece for us. Her feedback on the essay was like, whatever. And then it was like, let's talk. So this piece was called Different Worlds, and for flute and saxophone, alto saxophone. And I just remember like meeting with them for the first time about this piece, and they were like, "Hey, here's everything our instruments can do." And they were just playing extended techniques at me, really. And thinking back on that now, I mean, that was like such an important moment for me. That was really like my first ever composition lesson. Again, I was like probably a junior or senior in college, because then I was able to take this piece into a lesson with Jim Grant. And I don't really remember much about what we talked about. I remember he helped me kind of like re-envision the ending of this piece. And I think like Jim's sensibility of, I'll say like punctuation, musical punctuation, like the way you end phrases or extend phrases, or has played like a really important role in my life as a composer, actually. And I think the first moment was like, I had ended this piece on like a held note. And he said, "This is cool, but it's like they are just like, they go up to this note and they float away into space. What if you bring them back to Earth?" And he suggested I do this like kind of collapse back into like very short notes at the end. And that's what the piece is now. That's it's stayed that way ever since. This was 13 years ago. And, so I was like, "Oh man, Jim's like brilliant. Like I'm applying to grad school programs. Maybe he teaches somewhere and I can study with him." And I said that to him, and he said, "Oh no, I don't teach anywhere. I'm sorry to say, but there's this badass down in Florida named Baljinder Sakon that you should totally think about studying with him. And I can connect you guys, and just, I really hope that you'll consider that." And I thought, Florida, I don't want to live in Florida. But to make a long story short, I ended up living in Florida. I applied to the University of South Florida, where Baljinder was teaching. And it changed my life. There were some other options. A friend of mine had ended up at the Longy School of Music, which was in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in the Boston area. And I'd gone up there and met with the composers there. And I thought, okay, here's a friend of mine who like escaped Kentucky, escaped Moorhead. I was never really interested in escaping Kentucky, so to speak, like a lot of people I grew up with. But, I knew that if I wanted to do this thing, I should like get away. And I could always come back. And so I applied to Longy. I think I applied to Indiana University. Did not get any kind of call back there. But basically what ended up happening is I had a choice between Longy and the University of South Florida. I don't even remember the guy's name that I would have studied with at Longy, but it came down to funding, of course. And so I ended up in Florida. And yeah, it completely changed my life in ways I never could have imagined, not just musically or creatively, but just like in the most true sense, like life changing, right? And so Jim was my first encounter with a composer. And then I'd taken, like, truly, like, that's the one I remember. That's the important one. And then, of course, I had an interview with Balgender and Paul Reller, who was teaching at the University of South Florida. I guess those would have been like my second encounters with composers. And then when I got to school at USF, it was, I've said this on the podcast before, it's like I was living under a rock, thinking like, oh, the rock is this world. And not just being like enlightened into like an entire world that I didn't know existed, but like an entire universe of music that I had no idea existed. That's what starting grad school at the University of South Florida was for me. I became like aware of all these different things, and it was a nightmare for a semester, feeling like I had to catch up, being around peers who knew all these things that I had never heard of. I never felt like I wanted to quit, but, it was very, very overwhelming, which I've learned is like a common experience. So at this point I'm in grad school, I'm learning about so many composers. I think the first composition seminar with a guest composer was like Stuart Saunders Smith, who I've talked about on this podcast with my good friend Sean Hamilton. Stuart's music is, that was like, you can do what with rhythm? You can do what with space and time with music. And, it just like escalated from there. And so, there's so much to say about my time at USF. I think I've probably talked a little bit about it here and there throughout the course of this podcast. But that first semester, I mean, it was like an undoing of sorts. Like I remember like getting caught in the middle with pieces and like real life commissions from like people who were going to play my music, and getting caught in this like liminal space as a creator where I was trying to hang on to like aspects of my identity that I had developed, on my own, which I think was very important for me, by the way, having that foundation without composers, despite how overwhelming it was when composers came into my life. I was working on undoing a lot of stuff while, trying to try new things and experimenting with, my voice and the way I treated different musical elements. And I wrote pieces that people paid money for. They commissioned me, that left them very unhappy. I'm thinking of one piece in particular. And the piece has still never been played. And just like the challenge of that kind of transformation, I guess, really it's still left an impact on who I am as a composer today. But that only really lasted for a semester. And then I kind of got my poop in a group. And, I went all in. I was like super voracious, I feel like, about what I wanted to learn and experience and discover as a student composer, because I felt so behind. And that's what I think happened. And it wasn't before too long where it's like, okay, I feel like I'm like settling into like this new space as a composer, and, I'm applying to things, I'm winning things, and, it's kind of like snowballing from there. And so we're talking about, I was up to 22 or 23 years old now. And, I almost don't know what to say about it, because it made such a huge difference in my life. And there's so many tiny things that I'm glossing over, but I think you get the idea. So I think up until this point, the path I've described is more or less, one of a handful of paths that people might experience as composers. Maybe not. I know so many people now who like started, right out of high school as like composition majors. So, I didn't have that, but I think it was after graduating from USF that my path kind of became more unexpected and has diverged. I did the thing that I felt like I was supposed to. I applied to doctoral programs. I surprised myself in like some of the successes behind those applications, getting interviews at places that I never could have imagined like 3 years prior getting interviews at. I got accepted into some programs, but it wasn't enough for me to commit. And well, when I say it wasn't enough, like the financial aid wasn't enough for me to want to commit. And so I thought, well, I'll take a year off. I'll compose a bunch. I've been in school like my whole life. And then I'll apply again in the future. That 1 year has turned into 10 years. I mean, I've not yet applied to another doctoral program. And I feel pretty good about that at this point, because what I learned after leaving USF is a number of things. And I've gone through like kind of ebbs and flows along my path since then. Immediately after graduating, I was still in Tampa. I was still connected with other types of artists in the community. And, right away that summer after I graduated, I recall, doing a big collaboration with some dancers and other types of artists and other music friends of mine, doing that in the community. And, 2015, 2016, 2017, I was composing like crazy. It felt like crazy, but it was at a cost, I guess you could say. What I decided to do was the radio thing, as a living. And I understand like even people who are professors at universities teaching composition, like that's kind of like their day job. And then and I know people who do that who will tell me that they hardly ever have time to compose. So I kind of like found my day job in broadcasting as a classical music host. And again, I've talked at length about this in the very first episode of this podcast. And so I was like working part-time for a while, and I was composing as much as I possibly could. I was taking on commissions. I was applying to like opportunities, calls for scores, stuff like that. And things felt like pretty good in those years, as a creative being. But I think what ended up happening is as you do with the day job, I got more and more responsibilities. I ended up going on to salary. And, by the time late 2017, 2018 rolled around, I was kind of like killing myself. I was like, very figuratively. I was working full time. I was composing like a new piece every month or two. And around that time, my now wife, Susanna Hancock, and I had launched an event series in Tampa called Terroir New Music, which I won't get into much, but basically the premise was pairing living composers' music with local kind of culinary things like beers or meals, coursed out meals and stuff. It was a very rewarding experience, but in 2018, it was like a breaking point for me where I couldn't do it all. And so if you look at my list of compositions, you'll see like, all through grad school, 2013, 2014, up until like 2017, I'm like writing like a bunch of music every year, like 3 to 5 pieces. I think 1 year was even more. And then suddenly 2018 rolls around and it's like I wrote 1 or 2 pieces. And that's important. That's important to me. That shift has been a really kind of pivotal thing for me as a creator, which I'll talk about momentarily. So 2018 was also the year that I wrote Orchard, which I think a lot of people now know about. a collection of 50 solo piano works, which pianists love to play and other people who play other things love to play. And I always joke that it's like the project that won't die. That happened in 2018 and still continues. It's 2025 now. Orchard still continues to get played all the time. And, we're doing the terroir thing for a couple years in Tampa, a few years. I'm composing less and less and doing more and more radio. 2019, end of 2019-ish, end of the summer, I launched Modern Notebook, which is kind of the culmination of all of my work in radio and in composing, and kind of like using my platform to highlight the work of living composers. Because here's the thing and this is why I was so turned off by applying to doctoral programs, is it's not that I can't take rejection. That's part of being a living artist in the real world. Like, you apply to things and there's only so many spots for people to have, right? And through that whole process and the years afterwards, I was like, why am I competing with people I want to be friends with? I mean, or people I am friends with, like it doesn't feel good. And so Modern Notebook was kind of my answer to that. And this podcast is kind of my answer to that. It's like, what can I do as an artist to, do a little bit to lift up and help the people around me? And so that happened in 2019. And then the pandemic hit. And all the wind came out of my sails. Right before the pandemic, I completed 2 really big time pieces. When I say big time, I mean, they're long pieces. One is a solo clarinet piece that's about 13 minutes called Live Oak, which is, there's like a fractal organizational quality to that, as well as like numerous extended techniques. That was a commissioning consortium that 51 clarinetists joined, and it's only been performed 3 times because I delivered it in February of 2020. And then the pandemic happened. The other piece that I finished around that time, and at this point I'm living back in Kentucky, by the way. The other piece I finished at that time was 8 Aspects, which is for violin and piano. And it was just a commission. It wasn't a consortium. And again, it's like a 20-minute piece. And it's I feel good about it. It's like one of the few pieces I'm like super satisfied with, along with Live Oak. I was writing a lot of music in these years, by the way, that I just wasn't very satisfied with. And I couldn't tell you why at that time, but it's only been recently that I've discovered why. Finish these 2 pieces, the pandemic hit. I get a couple trickles of commissions, pandemic type pieces from some important people in my life. But other than that, like, everything goes dark. And I thought that was the case with everyone. I think most people experienced that. And that ended up not being the case. I would see all these pandemic online premieres and like projects and stuff, and all the same people getting involved with these. And I'm not saying like that's a bad thing. I'm happy for the composers who were able to kind of ride out the pandemic with some pretty high visibility projects. But that wasn't the experience that I had. And so there were moments where I was doing the radio thing again full time. Not that many people, pretty much no one, was asking me for new pieces. Again, I had a couple small commissions, and certainly no one was playing my music other than like the people who commissioned stuff for like an online performance. And so I really wondered, I questioned whether or not I should continue composing. And luckily the answer was yes, I should. And the next big piece that I wrote in 2021 was a string quartet commissioned by a friend of mine in Tokyo called Rebirth and Eternal Grove. And that piece, again, it's like a 20-minute piece that it kind of brought me back to life. That's why I called it Rebirth. And I feel like just now, like within the past few months, 2025. So from like 2021 to 2025, I felt like creatively stunted, pretty much. And I'm just now feeling like good again as a composer. So I would say, in asking this question about, do you feel like you followed a more conventional path, or were there unexpected twists with various people? It got me thinking, like, I'm going to keep asking this question, but what is a conventional path? What is unexpected? I think for me, I feel like I was led to believe that there was a way to do this and be successful and work hard. And that's been anything but the case. And so much of what I've ended up doing has fallen onto growing communities around the work that I produce, because I feel like that's where meaning is, and that's where success, my version of success, has blossomed, is through commissioning consortiums, or doing a Kickstarter, or working with creators of other things besides music, for example, which is another component of this podcast and other work I've done, like Terroir. So yeah, I don't know. Unexpected might be the right word. It might not be, but that's kind of where I have personally landed in this mess of a thing. So I'm sure that I glossed over like quite a bit of things that I'm not going to worry too hard about in terms of like the timeline of events. This has been going on for almost 45 minutes. I guess probably longer. And you probably want to hear more about like my creative philosophies, like I typically ask of my guests. So I'll start by answering the question that I ask everybody. What would you describe as the primary pillars of your creative practice? And a lot of people answer this question with 3 pillars. Sometimes I have to explain what pillars means. And to me, like, pillars is like what forms the foundation of an artist's work and ethos. And so for me, I wrote down 4 things. And the first thing is musical efficiency. And I don't want this to be confused with the kind of systematic tendencies. I've tried to be a systematic composer. I don't think that I am. But to me, musical efficiency is being smart with the materials that I use. And so devising a kind of interconnectedness among materials that are used within any given piece. And so this could show up in a variety of ways. It could be like deriving rhythm from harmony, or vice versa. It could be like, I mentioned fractal music earlier, where like smaller components of the piece kind of add up to reflect like the bigger narrative in some way. Recently, I completed a piano piece where there are these really kind of like very high notes at the start of the piece that are played in this kind of sporadic nature. And in another part of the piece, I bring those same exact pitches back, but in a different register, in a different context. And I'm not sure, I don't think like people will be able to hear it. I don't think it's this kind of musical efficiency is for people to hear. It's just like it's like what makes it fun for me. So kind of like, like the sum of its parts, kind of that kind of saying. That's how I think about a lot of my pieces and where I come from when I'm writing. It's a very much part of my process. This idea of musical efficiency. On the flip side of that, I just mentioned that, I've dabbled in systematic composition, and, where that kind of came from was this presumption on my part that I needed to be able to explain like how I made something. Musical efficiency is a little bit of like where I landed with that, but I was trying to like do the systematic thing, like to produce material and be able to explain stuff. And it just like, it didn't feel good. And so I began composing from a very intuitive place. And so I've come to really rely on and trust my musical intuition. And so a lot of the music now that I make, other than like the musical efficiency stuff that I just described, I can't tell you like the rhyme or reason of how I devise a harmonic language or a rhythmic language in my music. I just mostly do it because it sounds right. And sounding right is subjective, of course, but I know when it's not right. And so much of my process these days is maybe putting something down on the page, putting it into a notation software to be able to listen to it, and recognizing what is right about it, what is not right about it, and what can I do to get it closer to the music that feels like it wants to be. I think that's what I just described as like a very composer thing. I would never say that any of the stuff I'm describing is like unique or special to the way I work. But intuition, I've started in that place, I've left it, and then I've only recently like come to trust it again, I think. And kind of in this vein of intuition is an attempt to convey something organic in my music. And so a lot of times that manifests rhythmically, trying to separate, the sonic results of music from like pulse orientation. I really started thinking about this because, where I grew up in a very rural community, agricultural, industrial kind of community in Kentucky of like 8,000 people, and went to college, in Moorhead, Kentucky, which is also like in the middle of Daniel Boone National Forest, and not a very, like when school lets out for the summer, there's like no one in town except the townies, which I think it might be derogatory to say. But at any rate, nature was like a big part of my life, has always been a big part of my life. And so in walking through the woods, for example, it's like you're not going to come across like a rigid cube shape in the woods unless it's man-made. Yes, nature can produce these things, but mostly it's like, you're not going to see like a repetition of things out in nature. And so like, I thought that was like, that's what I wanted my music to sound like. I wanted it to sound like very organic, even improvised. I didn't want people to be able to like feel the pulse, for example, which I keep going deeper and deeper into with the projects I work on. So I think like that again, like kind of comes back to intuition, how can I think of making something sound organic? I guess you could systematize that, but I don't know how. And so I rely on my intuition. Another pillar of my creative practice is increasingly like a vibe of like ritual and patience. I've thought about ritual in my music for a while. There's been pieces I've produced that's like, this kind of feels like a little ritual, like whether it's the setup of the instruments. Like there's a piece I wrote for clarinet, euphonium, and percussion that's like, the percussion is like flower pots are hanging, and it felt like kind of like a ritual setup. And I recently went to a performance of a piece in Covington, Kentucky, which is right across the river from where I live in Cincinnati, and it was in this like kind of art space that had a gallery and a theater, and I walk in to the art gallery, and like I've been thinking about this idea of ritual a lot lately, especially in regards to like a piece that I just finished. And on the wall is like the name of this exhibit in the gallery, and like it took my breath away because it said Notations on Ritual. And I thought, what in the world? Like such a serendipitous kind of moment for me. And I'll read a little bit. I wish I knew who to credit for this. The curator is someone named Sora Kang. So maybe they wrote this, but I'll just read a little bit of this because I took a photo of it, and it felt like so aligned with like where my music is heading. And it's that the inaction of ritual is compositional. There's a musicality regarding its temporality, pace, repetition, and interpretive performance. Actions parallel to notations, a mark-making tool to indicate sound within a compositional score. Like notations on a score, they incite action, but also indicate action. They empty spaces between the notes. It can indicate tempo, rhythm, volume, speed. And so like this is like talking about a musical score. Like there was nothing musical in this. It's like ceramics and paintings and stuff like that. But, it's like feels so aligned with I think what I'm trying to achieve, like a ritual of like gesture through music and like the psychology of the score. It's like these are all things that I'm starting to think about. And then like a sense of patience. So ritual and patience. Patience, allowing for more space, more time. And I've spoken before, I don't think on the podcast, but elsewhere, of how this idea of patience and stillness and that's kind of like my answer to the world around me and like the life that I find myself in that's like full of deadlines and meetings and like I just want to like get away from all that. And so, rather than like creating maybe like an anxiety inducing music which has its purpose and that I enjoy sometimes, I really want to like savor the space and the moments that occur musically in my music. And I want listeners to savor that as well. The last thing I'll talk about with pillars is something that other people usually bring up when I ask them this question, but I feel the same for me. And that's curiosity. Curiosity has served me so well in my adult life and my professional life. And not just curiosity, but curation. And this is within music and elsewhere in my life. So always learning something, of course, that's curiosity, kind of like going down the rabbit holes, seeing where things take me. Like if I ask questions and want to find answers, that's curiosity. But like being very intentional about the way I curate stuff in my life as well, like what I consume, what I experiment with, what I look for, I see it as curation. I guess you could simply say like intention, but it really is like trying to like surround myself with meaningful artistic objects and otherwise for musical purposes, but also for other purposes in other aspects of my life. Okay, so what is a piece of music, a song, a film, a book, a piece of art, anything like that that has changed the way that I think about my creative work? I have several, and I'll try to be quick here. So the first one that I listed, and this is more or less in chronological order, the first one that I listed was Stravinsky's Rite of Spring. So this is like the piece for composers, I think. Like I don't know if you're a composer and you know the piece, or if you're not a composer and know the piece, you know what I mean. Like it's like an exalted piece for composers, the Rite of Spring. And I had encountered the piece obviously like through recordings, and I checked out the score when I was in undergrad to look at while listening to the recording. I did all that stuff, which I think all of us do as composers. But I listed this because of one specific encounter that I had with the Rite of Spring. It would have been around 15 years ago, and the Rite of Spring was being performed by the Cincinnati Ballet and Cincinnati Orchestra. It was the live orchestra with the ballet, and so I went, and it was close enough, and I was like, oh, I love this piece. I'd love to see it, choreographed. And if you don't know anything about the Rite of Spring, it's kind of about a ritual. Speaking of rituals, like ritual sacrifice, and it's kind of like a pagan sort of sacrifice kind of thing. I won't get into the full story. I'll probably get it wrong if I attempt to, but at any rate, that's kind of what I was expecting. What I didn't expect was that the way it was choreographed and the narrative that the Cincinnati Ballet chose to present this piece under was like related to environmental sustainability and climate change. And so again, there is like in the original ballet, there's like a chosen one that is sacrificed. And in this performance, there is also a chosen one. And the chosen one is nature. And the ballet happens, and at the very end, humankind chooses to sacrifice nature in favor of, I think, like industrialism and capitalism. And I mean, I was like sobbing afterwards. I'm about to, just like talking about it and thinking about it. And so I don't know what exactly, I mean, that was like super impactful, obviously. I mean, to see this like piece that everybody knows, like kind of framed in a new modern way. I mean, I think that really got me thinking about the power of, what we do as artists, and certainly like the power of like holistic artistic experiences, like live music and dance, that kind of thing. But it like forever changed the way that I thought about the Rite of Spring too. And so that's like the first kind of experience that I've had with a piece of music, that not the very first, but like the one that sticks out in my mind. Like I would have been like 20 years old when I saw this happen. The next piece of music that I listed for this question that changed the way that I thought about what I do was early on in grad school. I was introduced to an Oliver Nussin piece called Coursing. And it's a short piece. I'd never heard of Oliver Nussin before, and so let alone this piece of music. And it's scored for chamber orchestra, and I was like immediately captivated by this piece of music, and I didn't know why. It's like it got this like angular melody to it. It's like not really atonal, but it's obviously not like tonal in harmony. And I was just like, what is going on here? So I listened to it. And then I listened to it again, and I was like, oh, everybody is playing the same exact pitches. And I was like, what in the world? And the fact that like I didn't even notice it right away, I was like it blew my mind. And that's like, if you know my music, especially like anything with more than, a handful of instruments, I love like a good like unison moment, not just like everyone playing in octaves, but like everyone playing the same exact note. And that's what Nussin's piece was doing. And it kind of like split away after a while, but I was just like, man, what is that? It's like this exercise in like color and orchestration that just like blew me away, and truly did make me think about music in like a totally different way. And if you don't know the piece, please go listen to it. The next couple like inspirations, I guess, or like things that changed me, are books. And the first one is a book that I know many composers have cited as like an inspiration. And that's Italo Calvino's 6 Memos for the Next Millennium, which came out in 1985. It's like a series of lectures that the author presented on. And he was basically talking about literature and how like he kind of envisioned literature maybe evolving in after the year 2000. I think he died before he presented all of these essays, so we're only really left with like 5 of these memos. And so I have the book. I'm not going to read it because I don't think I'm allowed to. But the memos are lightness, quickness, exactitude, visibility, multiplicity, and then there's like a 6th one that I can't even read that's been like written, and it's like on a Post-it note photo that's in this book, and it's been like erased. And so I read it, and the copy I have in front of me is like highlighted like crazy, because immediately, I mean, if you know Calvino's work, you'll know that there's like a musical quality to it anyway. And so even though he's talking about literature, I was immediately able to make all these parallels to music in a very meaningful way. I wrote a piece about it, but my piece is on the substance of multiplicity, which, I just read the memos, and multiplicity is one of the memos. But he's like talking about, like, for example, exactitude, in a sense that like, can you be so precise with your words that it sounds natural? Like it's like a highly rigid kind of like, it's almost like scripted, right? Like if we're talking language, it's like you've written out a script and you're reading it, but it sounds like you're just like coming up with it off the top of your head. And I thought like that was really interesting. Like it would yield like really interesting musical results. And so, and the way I saw it related to that specific example is like comparing like Pierre Boulez to John Cage, whose music, I mean, they're certainly different composers, but like the musical results of their very different approaches kind of like end up in the same place, right? Like Pierre Boulez, hyper serialist, like very exact, but then like you listen to it and it sounds kind of random. Not, I'm not trying to be dismissive with that, by the way, or be deductive. And then there's John Cage, who relies on like chance operations and graphic notations and stuff like that. And then like that is like truly random. And again, I think like the musical result isn't really that much different. So that's kind of like what I was thinking about. And like, how can I be so exact in my music writing that it feels like very organic and improvised, like I was talking about before. So 6 Memos for the Next Millennium, really, I mean, again, about literature, but it totally changed the way I thought about music. And then the other book that I have listed that came after that is Wabi Sabi for Artists, Designers, Poets, and Philosophers. And Wabi Sabi is, this book says, the quintessential Japanese aesthetic, the beauty of things imperfect, impermanent, and incomplete. I discovered Wabi Sabi in 2015. Again, this is like other people are inspired by this, kind of pull from this. But it was interesting because when I discovered it and I read it, I was kind of like, I'm already kind of doing these things in my music. You know, I'm like leaning into like these imperfections, whatever that might mean, imprecise kind of way to go about things. You know, I was encouraging performers, like, you don't have to play it exactly, like it's approximate, you know, in terms of like rhythm and pacing and that kind of thing. But discovering Wabi Sabi like unlocked a commitment in my music, I think, is what I'll say. It unlocked this commitment that of like this is what my music can kind of do and be about, and it can be like an overarching kind of thread that runs through things. And I never think about it. You know, I'm not like reading about Wabi Sabi when I sit down to write a piece of music, but I think it's always kind of there. And I lean into it with like the utmost respect. You know, it's not like a cursory, like, oh, I'm going to use this thing because it's convenient to my music. It's like, I have a deep appreciation for this aesthetic. I have a deep appreciation for Japanese culture. And, you know, I recently got to go to Japan for the first time, and I did everything I could to feel like as respectfully a part of life there as I could. And so, you know, it goes beyond like, this is like an aesthetic for me to utilize. Like, I feel like it's almost like part of the lens through which I see the world is Wabi Sabi. And in turn, like music, I should say, is also the lens in which I interpret the world. So those two things work together, and that's kind of like where my artistry sprouts from. So Wabi Sabi for artists, designers, poets, and philosophers. And I think composers too. I mean, I guess composers are artists. And so the final thing that I have listed as something that changed the way that I think about my work is more recently, it's an album by a Japanese-Irish musician named Ermhoy, and her album Junebug Rhapsody, which is a reinterpretation, reconstruction, I think is the word that she might use, of a prior album of hers called Junior Refugee. So Junebug Rhapsody, Junior Refugee. All of it's like the same music, kind of. I mean, this is like stuff I'm gleaning from like reading interviews about the album with Ermhoy, like in Japanese, that's been like Google translated. And basically like her impetus was like she released Junior Refugee in 2015, and Junebug Rhapsody was released in 2023. And so if I'm understanding it all correctly, she realized, I guess, like the evolution of her artistry. I really hope I'm getting this right. I don't think she would ever hear this, but you know, you never know. and wanted to deconstruct and reconstruct the music in Junior Refugee underneath Junebug Rhapsody. And so it's like all the same songs, but like, for example, the opening track of Junior Refugee is called Call South Shofar. And the first track of Junebug Rhapsody is called Fall Mouth So Far. So each of the titles are kind of like, they feel the same in your mouth, I guess. And it's the same music, but like totally different. It's like this more mature version. And I'm not really sure like what it is about this that really changed the way I think about my work, but something happened where like I became obsessed with this album, like just listening to it over and over again and trying to understand like what changed and what's different and like how do you elevate like. And so I think in recent years I've had opportunities to kind of revisit some of my pieces and make them for different instruments, and certainly like that's an opportunity to explore this idea of like deconstruction and reconstruction of, you know, ideas that you had before, but like you're an evolved artist, you're more mature, you're a different person in a lot of ways. And so I think like I'm just now like kind of getting to the tip of the iceberg with this idea, but Ermhoy's Junebug Rhapsody certainly in some way has unlocked something inside of me that that is very inspiring to me. Okay, so like I mentioned at the beginning of this episode, I kind of fielded social media to see if anyone had any questions I could answer about my creative life. And this one from Andy actually is something I might adopt, and you might hear me ask other people because it's such a great question. And I immediately thought of an answer to it that I think kind of alludes to maybe some hopes and dreams of mine as an artist. And so Andy asked, what projects have you not yet had the chance to do but would love to take on? And I think if I had been asked this question like 5 years ago, I would have, or longer, I would have said like, you know, writing more orchestra pieces or writing a string quartet. Well, I got to write a string quartet, and I'd love to write more string quartets and more orchestra pieces, obviously. But there's a project that I like kind of conceptualized a long time ago, like around 7 or 8 years ago, that is sort of like a multimedia travel log related to Kentucky. So if you look at a map of Kentucky, I grew up in a town called Mount Sterling, which is off of I-64, which runs, you know, horizontally across the state. I-75 runs vertically through the state, you know, through Lexington, Cincinnati, places like that. And so if you look at a map, you know, there's where I'm from, which is close to that. It's like half an hour away from Lexington, just along I-64. And if you kind of quadrant the central part of the state, south of I-64 and east of I-75, well, that's like pretty much the Appalachian portion of the state. That's where like a lot of my ancestors are from. And I've had this like kind of dream project for, again, a long time, where I would basically go to a different county, like each of the counties of Kentucky, like in this part of Kentucky, and interview locals, kind of make some video B-roll footage of places, like see like any kind of interesting things I can discover about these places, and then write like a music composition like based off of these places. And there's a lot of really interesting place names in, well, all around the state and obviously all around the country. But I ended up making like a list. I mean, this is how deeply I got into thinking about this project. Is I made a list of like place names that were interesting that could serve as like the titles of each of these movements. I mean, these are real life places, like not quite towns, just like little areas throughout this part of Kentucky, like including the one for where I'm from, Montgomery County, that I listed is Grassy Lick, which again, it's like not like it's just like an area. And the importance of Grassy Lick, I think, in my family is, it's pretty important. There's like the ruins of an old church on top of a hill that was built, that like predates like the founding of Kentucky itself. and there's a graveyard there, a cemetery where like my great great grandfather is buried, maybe old. So like Grassy Lake is on this list. There's other places like Thousand Sticks, Soft Shell, Clover Bottom, Woodbine. I mean, so anyway, I thought like, oh, this would be like an interesting project that kind of honors my family history and kind of shines a light on like this part of the state that I don't know is like disappearing in a lot of ways, or is like overlooked, or people like make assumptions about it, based on people see like, like hillbillies and stuff like that. It's like, I wanted to like humanize that. So like, that's what projects have I not yet had the chance to do, but would love to take on. That's one of them. And then like the resulting, composition I could then present throughout this part of the state. And then like, I've kind of loved this idea of like doing a quasi journalistic documentary style sort of composition that serves as a travelogue of sorts. And so I think like doing more and more projects like that would be of huge interest to mine. Of course, it's like, where do I get the time and money to do that? But so I also got a question from Chris, who wrote to me asking, when you create your own notation, what problems are you trying to solve, and how does your notation solve those problems? First of all, Chris, thank you so much for this question. It's given me a lot to think about. And I think what Chris is referring to is, in some of my compositions, I kind of, and this has been happening more and more often lately, I've kind of abandoned what might be considered traditional notation, whether that is how the music looks on the page or how it's felt by the performer, or just, anything to kind of indicate an idea that kind of goes beyond what I feel is able to be expressed in traditional means. And so I'll share a couple examples of this that I think might answer this question. I don't really consider myself as anyone who really experiments with notation, but with my most recent piece, it's got me thinking a lot about, again, the psychology of how performers kind of see things on the page and how they feel the music within themselves based on what's on the page, and kind of how to change that psychology into something that's less restrictive. So the example that I'm thinking of is like conveying pulse. And so I mentioned earlier that I have this like pretty strong desire to make music that is separate from pulse. I think pulse introduces a lot of problems in the music that I'm trying to make. I'm trying to make it sound like kind of organic and free and like improvised in a lot of ways. And so, in the past, I've done this by kind of through rhythmic dissonance, which is like a bunch of tuplets. Basically, like I have a lot of quintuplets in my music to kind of get away from straight 16th note rhythms and stuff like that. And then I'll just tell the performer, like, you can approximate it and hope for the best, hope that they like understand what I'm going for. But with my most recent solo piano piece that I'm wrapping up now as of the time of recording this, it's felt like even that's not enough. And so, what problems am I trying to solve? I think that's the main problem is, how can I represent the sound in my imagination, the sound that I have in my mind, in a way that can't be confused or deduced to a like something that might feel a particular way. But I'm just now getting it to a point where I feel like I'm exploring this through notation. And so I don't really know where it will end up. I mean, this piece I'm talking about has like graphic elements, but the graphic elements, I mean, I had a lesson with one of my former teachers about this. And he's like, what's the purpose of this? And I was like, I don't know. I think it kind of looks cool. Sometimes it just comes down to that. But also, I really wanted to try my best to convey this idea that I don't want this music to be felt like music that you might be used to. This isn't revolutionary. This isn't like something that I'm the first person to ever do this, but certainly I feel like it's a new direction for me, and it's something I've been thinking about quite a bit lately. So again, I appreciate this question. I'm not sure that I answered it, but I think it goes to show, like, I feel like my artistry and creative sensibilities are always under like some sort of transformation, and I'm always thinking about these things and like trying to work towards whatever that kind of goal is. And I guess now might also be a good time to mention, I've mentioned this on the podcast before, but over the past few years, I've really been struggling with how to feel satisfied with the creative projects that I put out into the world. It's part of why this particular piece took me a very long time for me to compose, about 3 years, because I felt like I didn't have the tools to really express, and I don't even have the words really to articulate kind of like this urging I felt to move in this other kind of direction. And I'm just now starting on new projects kind of with all these things in mind, and I don't know where it's headed, but I feel really good about kind of where I've landed with it all. And so, yeah, I guess, stay tuned and see what I come up with, because I feel like I'm really just getting started after finishing this newest piece. Charlie wrote in with a question. Charlie is a fantastic composer who I met for the first time just recently. We hit it off, and I'm very excited to share a conversation with Charlie coming up on this season of the podcast. But at any rate, Charlie asked me a question that I had to think a lot about, and I'm not even sure I have a fully coalesced answer to this question, but he wrote in and asked, do you have an ultimate goal or dream as a composer? And the reason that I've had trouble kind of coming up with an answer for this is I don't know what ultimate would look like. I think like when I think about my life as a composer, probably the end goal, and probably the goal for all of us, right, is to be able to sustain a living, being just a composer. I think that would be a fantastic way to exist in this world. But I think beyond that, thinking about like broader goals that I have in my musical life, I mean, I don't know if I have a goal per se musically. I don't know if I don't know what I'm working towards. I know I'm working towards something, but I think that whatever that goal might be, kind of, it's elusive, and I kind of like, every piece reveals a little bit more of that goal. That's the feeling I have when I think about this question in that regard. But besides that, I think really one of my goals with my music is that, and one of my dreams is that it can just live everywhere. I've been very fortunate to have friends take my music all over the world. Performances happen all over the world, and music has allowed me to travel, to certain parts of the world and throughout the United States. I think like that makes my musical life feel very alive. And if I had to pick a goal, I think it would be that my music takes me places. And it's been doing that more and more, the older I get. And I just wanted to keep doing that even more so. And so, I don't know if that answers your question, Charlie, if that's a adequate ultimate goal, or a dream even. But I think, to see the world, to be in community with folks globally due to and through my music, certainly that is very much at the top of the list, I think. So getting into my final stretch of questions that I ask everybody, again, that I'll be answering myself. What do you think you would be doing artistically or otherwise if it wasn't composing? I mentioned on one episode, upcoming episode of the podcast, I asked this of someone and they like turn it around on me. And I mentioned briefly that when I was growing up, I really wanted to be like a weather man, like a person on TV who does the weather. I don't think that's like my answer, but it's kind of interesting. Some people answer this like, what did you want to be when you grew up, before you knew that, this was a thing, that I guess that was one of them. But honestly, I think like in the past, like 4 or 5 years, I've done more like physical labor type stuff. Like the studio that I'm recording this in, when we moved into our house, it was an unfinished basement. And so I got to like put up the walls and insulate and run electricity. My stepdad taught me how to do all that. And also like we built like a deck off of our house. And I just really love like making things. I mean, that's part of why this podcast is called Music Maker. And I love to talk to people who make things. But I mean like functional things as well. So, getting to build something that you then get to enjoy is I guess if I was doing that for a living, I'd be building stuff for other people to enjoy, I guess. But getting to build something and like having a tangible byproduct, so much about creating music is one, it's reliant on other people, which is, I love that part of it. But also, it's not quite like a physical object. It's like sciencey stuff that floats through the air when we really get down to it. So I think physically building something as a living, or perhaps something adjacent to that, like maybe engineering, like figuring out how to build stuff, or something else that I also love to do. That's like anytime I'm like getting organized or planning like a trip or whatever, is I turn to spreadsheets. I love spreadsheets. I love like kind of data collection and organization. So I don't know, maybe something related to that as well. A new question that I've started asking people, you'll hear it, after the first few episodes. What are you trying to get better at in your creative life? And I've loved hearing the answers to this question. And for me, it's two things. I'm trying not to be in so much of a hurry anymore. Kind of alluded to this earlier in the conversation, but there was a point shortly after, immediately and shortly after I graduated from my master's, where I felt like this like incredible sense of urgency, where I had to like be constantly producing and getting my name out there and like sharing stuff and blah blah blah. And I mean, I love like posting about my goings ons on social media and like the musical activities and creative projects I have going on. But like this idea that if I work hard, then I will be rewarded equally. That's just not been the case. And so I've really tried to like reposition my thinking to where like I'd love to be composing all the time and producing all the time, but even if I had all the time in the world, I don't know if I would spend it like writing a bunch of new pieces. I think I would just spend more time. And this is what's ended up happening. I just like spend more time on one piece, like trying to get it right. And so like the piece that I just completed, and hopefully my next few projects don't take this long. They can't. But the piece I just completed took me 3 years to like kind of finally get to where I wanted it to be. So I don't know if like being that little in a hurry is what I want to be doing, but definitely like kind of savoring the process a little more. And also the other thing that I'm trying, on that note, the other thing I'm trying to get better at in my creative life is finding validation in the process of creation rather than like externally. I think external validation is important. I think it's something that obviously if you want to get ahead in your career, you kind of have to have that, I think, but it's like really taken me to some dark places in my creative life and psychologically speaking, and like kind of led me to some depressive episodes of, I'm not winning anything and I'm not, and so, yeah, I mean, I'll be honest, it's taken a lot of hard work to be able to settle on, okay, let's try to find validation in the process. Let's find the joy of making again. That was such a joyful thing for me at one point in my life. And I think my life took me away from that. And now I'm finally back in a place where I can do that, to the point where, I don't really know how to say this any other way. So I hope that it lands properly. But, it was kind of drilled into me grad school onward that I should only take on commissions. I should only, if I'm writing music, it needs to be because I'm being paid to write music. I think there's, that's important. But what I've since discovered is that like I need to be writing music for the joy of writing music. And, I'll be selective about those kinds of projects, write stuff that I think will get played by people in real life. That's a vital part of what we do. But I think like a mixture of making music for the sake of making music and still taking on commissions and paid work and stuff like that, I think is where I'm at now. Is there a tool that you use in your creative practice that you think everyone should know about and that everyone else could benefit from? I have two. They've come up with other guests on the show so far, but these are like, I have a lot going on in my life, and it's all about organization and efficiency. What I'm learning is like optimizing certain parts of my life to give myself the space and the time and energy to pursue creative projects, which I have denied myself from like the past few years. And so two things that I use that I think, a lot of people might be able to benefit from if you're finding yourself for lack of time to do the things you want to be doing. One is specifically a traveler's notebook. I learned about traveler's notebooks from a YouTuber called Maurice Moves. It's like a travel YouTuber. It's admittedly like a very dude-oriented kind of YouTube channel, but he started going on about how like the traveler's notebook was like the main thing in his life that kept his life together. And I have to say, I like bought one immediately. It's a Japanese brand, and basically there's the notebook itself, which is just a leather cover. And it's like a notebook system with like modular. I know there's other brands that do this, but it's like a modular inserts for this notebook. So like I have my notebook set up now with, my planner. There's a notebook, like a lined notebook for like, jotting down ideas. I feel like I've wanted to set it up for like journaling at some point. I went on Etsy and found inserts for sheet music so I can have like sheet music. And this is like a small rectangular thing that can fit in pretty much any bag. So the traveler's notebook, it's a modular system that just like keeps my life together. Again, in like a tangible physical object kind of way that's like very important to me. And on the flip side, which is like kind of related, but kind of not, is Notion, which is a website and I guess a web app. And again, this has come up on the podcast before with my last guest of last season, Austin Hammonds, who's a wonderful film composer and friend of mine. And he mentions Notion as this tool that he recommends to everyone. And I had started using it at that point, but only recently in the past few weeks have I used it to start like really organizing every little bit of my life. Not every bit, like my working life. And it has just like, I don't even know how to get started talking about it, but you can make databases. You can have like sub pages that like helps you with like checklists and jotting down ideas and like all. So I use it for like the podcast. I use it for the radio show. I use it for my compositions. I use it to track like things I want to apply for. It's all there in Notion. And so these two tools, Notion and Traveler's Notebook, one being like computer based, I guess, or like on my phone, there's an app, and the other being like a physical object, has like really made my life better really in the past month or two. And so that's something I'm going to keep doing. And it's two things that I would encourage you to explore as well. All right. I've talked a lot and I appreciate you sticking with me here for this long. So I will end with my final question that I ask everybody, which is, what is something that you've never had a chance to say about your art that you've always wanted to share with people? And I have two things, and I think like one is really like more to do with my life, and that is figuring out how I can transform fear or anxiety or even just ignorance into enthusiasm. This is something I only recently became aware of that I've been doing like for a very long time. And I'll give a few examples of this, but it was my friend Aaron Beatty, who like a year ago, he introduced me to his now fiance, and he was describing me in front of me to her and was like, yeah, Tyler is like anytime he's uncomfortable with anything, he just goes all in and figures out how to like it. And I was like what? And I thought about it for about 10 seconds and I was like, actually, that's true. I didn't realize that I did that. And it's like my greatest strength, I think. Musically, this happened in grad school where I was very uncomfortable artistically and very self-conscious about what I did not know. And so I went all in. And to a degree where now I I've had my former teacher asking me for like composer recommendations for one reason or another, like I feel like I've settled on being able to have a pulse for our world of music, of contemporary music, which I'm very excited about and proud of, and very privileged to have. I'll say, when I was growing up, I mentioned this in a future conversation, so you'll hear this again. But growing up, I was terrified of thunderstorms. I had like a really weird, bad experience as a child related to like a tornado, I think, and it like left me paralyzingly afraid of thunderstorms for like a good early portion of my life. And it was only through learning about it and becoming like kind of borderline obsessive with weather that, again, like I thought I wanted to be a weatherman at one point, was I able to like overcome that fear and like have an appreciation for something. More recently, I developed like an anxiety about flying. I'd always loved like air travel until I didn't. And then I hated it and like was like fetal position nervous about it a time or two. And so I did everything I could to like learn about how aviation works. And now I'm like enthusiastic about it, I don't think a lot of people see this in me. I'm thankful that at least my buddy Aaron saw it in me to make me aware of it, that, I will take every chance I get to transform any kind of uncomfortability into enthusiasm. Aaron's example, by the way, that he told his fiance was, I was once the pickiest eater. Like I wouldn't eat hardly anything. I never ate vegetables. I never ate fruit. And now I'm like one of the most adventurous eaters that I know. So I think that's what he was kind of thinking about and talking about at that time. And the last thing I'll say, which is connected to my art, is that when I first started composing, I really wanted to come at it from like an emotional kind of stance. I wanted to feel something when I wrote. And for whatever reason, I think like going through things academically, kind of like becoming aware of like all that's out there in contemporary music, at a certain point, I abandoned having an emotional attachment to the music and art that I made. And it's only recently that I've started coming back to that. And I don't know what you're supposed to do with that information. It's just, I've never really like shared that with anyone. I've never shared that this is what my music used to do and that I quit doing it in my music, I think. And that I've been a little lost without having an emotional stake in my music. So, that's something I'm really excited to kind of explore more in a more mature way in my art making. And so, yeah, never really shared that with anyone. So, so there you go. All right, that's it. That's me, I guess. So I know I have a tendency to ramble, so thank you so much for sticking around to the very end here. I appreciate you listening. And if you'd like to learn more about me and my music, you can log on to my website. It's just tylerklinemusic.com. I'm Tyler Kline. Thanks so much for joining me for this episode of Music Maker. I've got so many great guests in store for you here in the coming months. And Music Maker with Tyler Kline is a production of Loose Leaf Transmissions, made for all ears. You can find more episodes and support the network on our website, looseleaftransmissions.com. That's going to do it for this one. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you back here next time.